how has COVID-19, but then the additional port restrictions impacted border communities?
Lorraine, I cannot overestimate the impact that COVID itself has had directly on the communities, as well as policies that have been state, national, or international. The U.S. Census Bureau just released the data for 2020, and I apologize, I have to read them. They're fresh, kind of off the presses. But because of the border crossing restrictions that were imposed by U.S., Canada, and Mexico, limiting or restricting border crossings to only essential travel, we see for the Arizona Port of Entry systems, cars for 2020 were down 32%, pedestrians were down 44%, total people, that's pedestrians, people in cars, bicycles, were down 43%. That translates to approximately 10 million people less that crossed the Arizona Mexico border over 2019. That is the spillover impacts of that huge number of people who are not crossing, not going to our stores, not going to our restaurants, not buying things, is a tremendous impact to our border communities, but also to the state and to the nation.
It's economically devastating because these communities rely on sales tax, and we have seen in Douglas, Nogales, I'm sure this is the case in San Luis, where businesses have shut their doors.
Many businesses are either closed down or on the brink of closing down. For our border communities, they depend on anywhere between 50 to as much as 70% of the sales tax revenue in those communities is directly attributable to the Mexican visitor. So when you have a 45% drop in the number of people, it's just a huge impact. I do have to add to that we've been very fortunate that over these past few years, we've been working actively on major infrastructure investments. The modernization of State Route 189 in Nogales, the fixing of the IOI, the International Off-Road Interceptor in Nogales, projects that are about to go online in Douglas and are about to go online in San Luis. Those sales tax for those major construction projects that are in the $100-200 million range are sustaining the sales tax revenues on a whole. But when you look at individual sales tax revenues, restaurants, shops, Walmart, all their sales are dramatically down.
You also have the ear of state and federal lawmakers here in Arizona. What do you recommend to them during these precarious times?
I think for instance, the proposal by Congressman Grijalva on the Rescue Act for small business, I think is absolutely an appropriate measure. Why do we think that border businesses, are worthy or deserving of this special attention? Is because when, for instance, the state of Arizona was shut down earlier in 2020, then there was a gradual opening. But as we were discussing earlier, border communities continue to be impacted by border crossing restrictions, even though you're able to move about in Arizona. So the full recovery or the partial recovery of the economy in Arizona, border communities are still hindered in that recovery because of the border crossing restrictions. That's why we're advocating for those provisions. More of a long term, I think there's lessons to be learned here. When we look at our ports of entry, they're built for a 20th century approach to border security, maybe some new technology and some of our most recent infrastructure. But we now have to look at the health safety of the traveling public, of the CBP officers that are staffing those booths, how we approach security, how we approach infrastructure, how we approach procedures. All of that is changing because of COVID-19.
Late last year, you told me that it was obvious that border communities would need special attention coming out of this pandemic. Do you still feel that way?
Oh, absolutely. As long as the border crossing restrictions, and I anticipate they will continue for several months, the impact of these border communities on both sides of the border, not just the Arizona side, but also on the Sonora side, because U.S. citizens are not traveling as much. We see that in Puerto Peñasco or Rocky Point. These are communities that there might be an international boundary dividing them, but they're fully interconnected communities. So the inability to cross freely because of the COVID restrictions continues to have an impact and will until the restrictions are lifted. The one thing that I do find, I'll say, of interest, and it must be noted, is that border crossing restrictions were on the agenda for the Biden administration in their first 3 or 4 days. It is important. Happy to see that it's getting this level of attention. Now we're waiting to see what they're going to be putting forth as the new policy for the border.
All right, Luis Ramirez, thank you for your insight.
Thank you, Lorraine.